Welcome to I Got Stuck, a catalog of temporary obsessions, with me, your host, Dr. Kelly Reedy, wherein each week I'll give you a full report on the latest topic that's kept me up at night. Things that have led to countless hours of procrastination through Googling, asking Jeeves, and navigating the twistiest and turniest of internet rabbit holes. You all should know that I'm really excited about this one. It's definitely not for everybody, but you won't know until you listen, right? I'm recording this really close to Halloween, so I am in full tilt creepy mode, and because of that, I couldn't help but revisit this terrible, awful nightmare of a love story. I definitely got stuck, as I reliably will when I think about the story of Carl and Elena. I said when I started researching this, I'm just going to refresh my memory on this story. I'll be done in like 10 minutes. Fast forward 2-3 hours later, and I'm still learning new stuff. Absolutely stuck. Want to join me? I'm taking your silence as a yes, which is unfortunately kind of a theme here. Carl Tanzler. He was born in Dresden in 1877 and moved to Australia in the early 1900s. He had intended to only pass through Australia on his way to the South Sea Islands, but he liked it, and he stayed there for a little over 10 years. He was put in a concentration camp during World War I for, quote, safekeeping, and before they released him and his fellow prisoners, they shipped him all to Europe. When he finally got out, all he wanted to do was find his mother. He did that, and he went and lived with her for a few years. And that's where he met Doris Schaefer, who became the love of his life. I'm just kidding. She absolutely did not. But in 1920, he did marry her and have 2 kids with her. What you need to know about Doris is that when she married 43-year-old Carl, she herself was 18. And they had those 2 kids, seems like pretty soon after they got married. But enough about Doris. Carl had been hanging out with his mom for a few years at this point. Finally, the mom said, "Hey, Carl, why don't you go live closer to your sister now?" And his sister was living in Florida. So in 1926, Carl moved to Florida. He settled near Tampa, and Doris and his kids stayed behind in Germany temporarily. Here's where things start to pick up a little. Somewhere in this time period, he started to go off the rails. It's unclear to me exactly when, but I like to imagine it was something that Florida brought out in him. And I like to think that because Florida, but also moving to a new country is a classic reason a person might reinvent himself. Usually this means like a new career path, new hobbies, a fresh haircut or something. But Carl took the reinvention much further through lying about himself. He claimed to have gotten 9 degrees from the University of Leipzig, but it turns out there's no official record of him ever attending the University of Leipzig in the first place. He also said that he grew up in a castle, which he did not. He also said that a German noblewoman named Anna Constantia von Cosel was his ancestor. She was a real person with a pretty wild life, definitely a rascal, somebody worth looking into a little bit. She was a countess who dabbled in high society. She even had an affair with the King of Poland. She lied about being married to a baron, and she was eventually exiled and imprisoned for 17 years. There's even a movie about her life called Hrabina Kosel, which is Polish for Countess Kosel. She died over 100 years before Carl was born, but he knew about her because she came to him in dreams. Carl had a dream that this noblewoman ancestor, Anna Constantia von Cosel, told him that he was actually a count. When he woke up from that dream, he said, "Yeah, that sounds right. I am a count." He proceeded to add the title to his name, Count Carl Tanzler. That didn't quite have a good enough ring to it, so he also changed his last name to match that of his ancestor, so he became Count Carl von Cosel, and sometimes he went by that version of his name. Also, somewhere along the way here on this crazy train, he bestowed upon himself the title of Doctor. So to recap, he went from Carl Tanzler to Count Dr. Carl von Cosel. But the new title and new last name aren't all that his supposed ancestor gave him. What's more important to this story is that she showed Carl a vision in his dreams of his future wife, a dark-haired beauty. I've read conflicting things about when he had this vision. Most sources say childhood, some say much later. So anyway, after that dream, lo and behold, that same dark-haired beauty herself came to him in a new vision, and she stayed with him for 7 days in a vision. He vowed to her, within that vision, that he'd find her again one day and they would be together. So again, not sure when that happened, but in the life story of Carl, we've made it up to the late 1920s. He came to the U.S. in 1926. His family joined him about a year later, and then right after that, he moved from the Tampa area to Key West, Florida, and left his newly arrived family behind. When he moved to Key West, he started working in the medical field and got a job at the Marine Hospital. Just to remind you, he was going by Count Dr. Carl von Cosel at this point. And also to remind you, only the Carl part of that was real. Also, on the lies front, Carl said that he built an airplane from scratch, but this was probably another classic Count Dr. von Cosel lie. There was an old plane in his yard, but it was almost definitely an old plane he got a hold of and tried to restore, and failed. Count Dr. von Cosel's airplane is, in a way, the Chekhov's gun of this story. Chekhov's broken airship. But back to the timeline here. When Carl started working at this Key West hospital, he wasn't given a job as a doctor because the hospital couldn't find any records saying that he had ever studied medicine. So they essentially made him an orderly, and they had him working as an x-ray tech and doing some other odd jobs. And then, one fateful day in April 1930, a new patient came in for an exam. A 21-year-old Cuban-American woman named Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos, usually known as Helen or Elena. Elena was, you might say, a dark-haired beauty. A vision. Like something from a dream. Uh-oh. Carl recognized Elena as the woman from his visions and dreams and became immediately obsessed. He met her during her first exam, and then she had to come back later for a chest x-ray because they were trying to figure out whether or not she had tuberculosis. That was the leading cause of death in Key West at that time, by the way. But he told her that if she did in fact have tuberculosis, she shouldn't worry because Count Dr. Carl von Cosel would save her. Here's the scoop on Elena. At this time in her life, around age 20, both of her parents were alive, she had 2 sisters, and she was married. It wasn't a great marriage because her husband had moved to Miami after she miscarried their child, but still, she was married. And also, Carl at this point was 53 years old. Sadly, after the tests were done, Elena was diagnosed with tuberculosis. And so Carl got to work trying to keep his promise and save the life of his soulmate. He did his best with the 0 medical knowledge that he had. He stole equipment from the hospital and took it to Elena's family's house. He made a bunch of medicine. He showered her with sweet nothings and lavish gifts. An article about this at kqed.org says, look up doing the absolute most in the nearest dictionary, and you'll find a handsome little photo of our friend Carl. But weirdly, none of this was working. Also worth noting, and not the least bit shocking, is that Elena never seemed to reciprocate this weird love that Carl had for her. I mean, yeah, she was being wooed while slowly dying of tuberculosis, and that might have had something to do with it, but by all accounts, she tolerated him as her fake doctor for a while, and that was it. He proposed to her multiple times. She politely declined every time, but eventually he got out of control and she and her family fired him. But her health continued to get worse. When Count Dr. Carl found out that Elena's TB was getting really, really bad, he broke into her family's house and announced that he was now, again, in charge of her treatment, regardless of what anybody wanted, and he started doing this shock treatment thing on her using a Tesla coil. Sounds pretty extreme and pretty dangerous, and of course, it didn't work. Carl tried other wacky stuff, including trying to vacuum her throat clean. And then finally, probably luckily for her, in October of 1931, Elena died at home. Of tuberculosis? Maybe. I'll get back to that. Carl, of course, tried to bring her back to life, and when that didn't work, he, of course, paid for her funeral and her burial. He eventually paid for a big, elaborate, above-ground mausoleum to be built for her, because after she was buried normally, He was worried that rainwater would leak into her coffin. Why would that matter, though, if she's dead? It would decompose the body faster, but isn't that kind of how death works? So he had this above-ground mausoleum built so that her body wouldn't get destroyed, and as everybody learned later, Carl was the only person who had a key to this mausoleum. I'm guessing you're seeing where this is going. Carl visited Elena's grave every night for a year and a half. Everybody in town, including Elena's family, knew about this and thought it was weird, but nobody knew how weird. During this time, Carl had started to have visions again. This time in his visions, dead Elena was coming to Carl and begging him to take her body out of the mausoleum. Finally, he quit visiting her grave every night, which did not make anybody feel better. In fact, it made everybody pretty suspicious and freaked out. Elena's family assumed that Carl was up to something that they weren't going to like, but they didn't know the extent of it. They didn't know that he had actually stolen her body. Just, being a good fake doctor, trying to follow the wishes of his dead patient that she communicated to him through a vision. So he removed her body from the cemetery grounds, put it in a child's toy wagon, and took it home. In a child's toy wagon. And if you're thinking that's a little gross since she had been dead for a year and a half at this point, don't worry. Count Dr. Carl had a plan, and he had a special laboratory ready to go to work on his patient. And remember that airplane that he claimed to have built? His plan was to use it to take Elena's body into space, where all the radiation would bring her back to life and reverse any decay that had already happened to her body. In his words, he was planning to take her, quote, high into the stratosphere so that radiation from outer space could penetrate Elena's tissues and restore life to her somnolent form. So you'd think that would be the first order of business, but I guess the plan wasn't that easy. Probably because I'm guessing that airplane he supposedly built didn't actually work. So Carl pivoted. Instead of taking Elena to space to bring her back to life, he focused on essentially turning her body into a doll. He stuffed her body with rags, he gave her glass eyes, he connected her bones with piano strings, which is my favorite detail, and he posed her using coat hangers. He somehow had already gotten her hair from her mother and turned it into a wig. And what about her skin? Well, in places where it was decaying, he replaced it with silk that had been coated with wax and plaster of Paris. So the body was taken care of, all set, all good. What about the smell? For that, he continuously sprinkled her with oils and perfumes and disinfectants to cover up that rotting corpse smell. Okay, so the technical stuff, taken care of. Now, moving on to style. The love of Count Dr. von Kossel's life couldn't simply wear her funeral clothes all the time, right? So Carl regularly went shopping for dresses and jewelry for her. Lots of silk dresses, because those were his favorites. Style? Check. Taken care of. She's posed, she's dressed. Now, where did he keep her? Brace yourselves. He supposedly kept her body, her decomposing body, in his bed. And to answer your question, there was no proof of sexual activity, but the coroner's report stated that a paper tube was found in Elena's body. And yes, that paper tube had been placed exactly where you're hoping it wasn't placed. Anyway, she's stuffed, she's wired, she's stylish, she's perfumed, she's in his bed, and as an Atlas Obscura article puts it, this domestic Ed Gein-style bliss went on for 7 years. 7 years. But people did get suspicious because of a few factors. 1, he kept buying all these women's clothes. 2, he had stopped visiting Elena's grave. And 3, brace yourself again for the kicker here. A local boy was pretty sure he had seen Carl dancing in front of an open window with what looked like a life-size doll. This is what led Elena's sister to go visit Carl in 1940 and confront him about the rumors and the speculation. When she got there, sure enough, she found her sister's rotting, waxy, perfumed body in Carl's bed. At first, she thought it was just a wax replica of her sister, but later she found out that was the real deal. And can you believe that when she found out, Elena's sister demanded that Carl give back the body? How dare she? The sister did, of course, report this to the police, and Carl was arrested and charged with wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. They checked to see if he was mentally competent enough to stand trial, and yes, indeed, he was. And yes, indeed, he was released with no problems at all, because it turns out that the statute of limitations on the crimes he was being charged with had expired. He'd even told them about his plan to shoot her into space in the airship to resurrect her. Still, no charges. It's almost like a weird necrophilic common law marriage thing. Common law body snatching, maybe? Oh, and after the trial ended, he visited Elena's mausoleum one more time and then blew it up with dynamite. Even though he wasn't charged for stealing Elena's body and keeping it at his house for over 7 years, he did have to surrender the body. It was examined by doctors, and it was put on public display at a funeral home. Specifically, the Dean Lopez Funeral Home, which still exists today, as I learned at KeyWestParanormal.com. While it was on display, it was visited by nearly 7,000 people. And from what I've read, it sounds like the general public thought of Carl as a pretty sympathetic character. They thought it was romantic. I repeat, Florida. After she had been on display for a while, she was finally reburied, this time in an unmarked grave in a secret location within, most likely, Key West Cemetery. Carl tried to find her, but he never did. Instead, he built a life-size replica that he lived with for the rest of his life. He even made a plastered death mask for that doll to wear. True love. Some reports say he died cuddled up with his life-sized Elena doll. Some reports say the doll wasn't a doll at all. He had been able to switch the doll with the real body. Some reports say Elena did not die of tuberculosis. I mentioned this possibility before and said I'd come back to it. Here I am, back to it. Apparently in 1982, 30 years after Carl's death, some construction workers found a note that he had supposedly written. In this note, he confessed to poisoning Elena. Quote, "She died because I gave this to her mercifully. I mixed the root of wolfsbane with aconite diluted. It was palatable, and my loved one departed this miserable world on October 25th, 1931. Suffer no more, sweet Elena. I have sent you to the angels with my golden elixir." Well, there you have it. Love, as they say, is a many-splendored thing. Carl wrote his own version of what happened and got it published in a pulp magazine called Fantastic Adventures in 1947. The story was called The Secret of Elena's Tomb. I haven't found it yet, but I definitely plan to. I really wish I could travel back in time and play the Jonathan Richman song, Let Her Go Into the Darkness, to old Carl. But speaking of music, there's a play about this story that's based on a book about this story, both written by the same guy, Ben Harrison. They're called Undying Love, and a new version of the play that's actually now a musical, still called Undying Love, opened in Key West on Valentine's Day 2018. And this is where I'll leave you. I really don't know what to say here, but I think the moral of the story is always double check your doctor's credentials. That's all I've got. Depending on when you're listening, I hope you had or are having or will have a happy Halloween and that you enjoyed this insane real-life corpse bride story. This theme song was written and recorded by Clark Blomquist. P.S. I considered telling a joke about a body snatcher, but I thought, I better not. They might get carried away.